The Elder Scrolls was never supposed to be an open world at all. Bethesda set out to build a gladiator combat game and quietly let it mutate into something else entirely, then slapped a new name on it just to survive the pivot. Almost every game in the series after that got saved the same way, by a team pulling back from an idea too big to finish. Arena, the biggest open-world franchise in gaming history, was never supposed to have a world in it at all, just a gladiator pit. That is genuinely how The Elder Scrolls started, as a small combat game with zero interest in continents, quests, or lore. Around 1992, Bethesda pitched something called Arena. Not the epic, the literal thing. You picked a squad of fighters, the Arena team, and you dragged them from city to city fighting scripted tournaments for cash and glory. No dragons, no ancient prophecies, no walking across a continent for 40 hours to deliver a letter. Just fight, win, travel, fight again. Somewhere in development, that plan started leaking at the seams. Bethesda kept bolting on side quests. Then explorable towns, then more towns, then the actual landmass of Tamriel, because apparently, once you let designers build one city, they cannot stop themselves from building 60. The arena fights, the entire original premise, got quietly buried under the exact features that would define the series for the next 30 years. By the time Bethesda noticed what had happened, the game barely resembled its own pitch, so they did the only sane thing left. They slapped The Elder Scrolls onto the front of Arena to make it sound like the sprawling role-playing epic it had accidentally become, and shipped it in 1994 as their first ever RPG and first original property, after years of grinding out sports titles nobody remembers. Fans love to treat Arena as some poetic nod to Tamriel being one giant battlefield of warring factions. It is a nice reading. It is also backwards. That name is not lore. It is a fossil. The leftover label from a scrapped gladiator brawler that Bethesda never bothered to rename once the game outgrew it entirely. A tiny studio built its entire future on a game that stopped being the game they set out to make, mid-build, with no plan B if it hadn't worked. But letting a game grow past its own title is one thing. The very next entry let the world grow so far past reason that it swallowed a chunk of the planet whole. Daggerfall. In 1996, Bethesda shipped a video game with a map bigger than most countries, and it ran on a computer that struggled to play a CD without freezing. That is not an exaggeration for effect. The scary part is not that they attempted it. The scary part is what they were willing to break to pull it off. The Elder Scrolls 2. Daggerfall covered roughly 160,000 square kilometers of Tamriel, spanning the regions of High Rock and Hammerfell. That is close to 2/3 the size of the entire United Kingdom. Put another way, it is roughly the size of Florida, rendered in a single explorable game world, decades before anyone had the hardware to make that a reasonable idea. Bethesda did not hand-build a single inch of it. They could not have. No team on Earth was hand-placing 160,000 square kilometers of terrain in the mid-1990s. Instead, they wrote procedural rules, algorithms that spun up towns, dungeons, and wilderness out of modular pieces, then let the code do the actual building. Thousands of settlements exist in Daggerfall that no human ever designed. That is the same instinct we already saw with Arena, a studio reaching past what their tools could responsibly deliver. Except this time, the ambition did not just drift off course, it actively broke the product. The procedural systems generated dungeons so repetitive and maze-like that players got hopelessly lost inside their own quests. Bugs stacked on bugs, quest lines could softlock. An entire country's worth of geography existed, and huge stretches of it felt like the same 3 buildings copy-pasted into infinity. Somewhere in Bethesda's offices was a small team who had just built one of the largest game worlds ever made, watching it ship half-broken anyway, because there was no time or money left to fix what the algorithm had built wrong. That is the actual lesson buried in the 160,000 square kilometer number. It was not a triumph so much as a warning label. Morrowind, Oblivion, and Skyrim all shrank the map dramatically compared to Daggerfall, trading raw scale for worlds a team could actually finish by hand. Some fans still point at that Daggerfall figure like it is proof the series has been playing it safe ever since. Maybe. But it is just as easy to read it as the moment Bethesda learned that bigger does not mean better, it just means more places for things to go wrong. So having overreached on sheer size, Bethesda's next move was not to build bigger or smaller. It was to gamble on building stranger, and the world they almost picked instead would have made this entire series unrecognizable. Morrowind. The most beloved Elder Scrolls world almost didn't happen because the safer, blander version was sitting right there on the table, ready to go. That is not a knock on the game. It is the whole reason the game works in the first place. By the early 2000s, Bethesda had not yet locked in the idea that would define the series forever. One entry, one province, one distinct culture. That structure was still wet cement when Daggerfall shipped, and it was still being poured when Morrowind entered planning. The team had room to pick almost anything. They could have leaned back into the kind of pseudo-European castles and countryside fantasy that Daggerfall had already proven audiences would accept without complaint. Familiar terrain, familiar risk, zero surprises, zero danger of alienating anyone. Instead, they picked Vardenfell, a volcanic island sitting under a permanent ash cloud, giant insect shells hollowed out and used as houses, mushroom towers rising out of the swamp, and an entire culture, the Dunmer, built around ancestor worship and open hostility toward outsiders. Nothing about it looked like standard fantasy. That was the entire point. Nothing in the historical record spells out a rejected map with a name written on it, but the pattern is impossible to miss once you follow it through. A young studio, one entry removed from nearly collapsing under Daggerfall's own bloated ambition, had every commercial reason to play it safe. Instead, it used that fragile moment to make its strangest, most alien game yet. That is not a company hedging its bets. That is a team deciding the identity of the entire series was worth gambling on. It worked. Morrowind became the cult favorite, the one people still argue is the real Elder Scrolls experience. But Bethesda's own next move gives away exactly how nervous that bet actually made them. The following mainline entry pulled straight back into lush, familiar, high fantasy Cyrodiil, the exact kind of setting Morrowind had been built from the ground up to reject. That is the quiet tragedy sitting underneath all that alien scenery. Somewhere inside, Bethesda was a team that proved their weirdest instinct was also their best one, and the studio still walked it back the very next chance it got. Committing to a world that strange was one kind of creative gamble. The next entry gambled in a completely different direction, trying to build a place so lifelike it would start contradicting itself before a single player ever logged in. Radiant AI. Bethesda built an AI so good at being alive that it had to be lobotomized before launch. Not nerfed for balance, not cut for time, deliberately dumbed down because it worked too well and started eating the game alive from the inside. The pitch behind Oblivion's Radiant AI sounded like science fiction for 2006. Every NPC in Cyrodiil would get a real schedule, real needs, real autonomy. Eat, sleep, work, wander home at night like an actual person with an actual life. No more mannequins standing in one spot reciting the same 4 lines until the heat death of the universe. Then the system started solving its own problems, and nobody had told it which problems were off limits. An NPC who needed food and didn't have any would just take it. Didn't matter whose it was. That same logic didn't stop at bread. It bled into every need and every item the game tracked, which meant the AI was making decisions nobody had scripted and nobody could fully predict. Testers watched characters commit crimes that were never supposed to happen. Quest-critical items vanished into the wrong inventories. NPCs who were supposed to coexist started solving their disagreements permanently, on their own schedule, with zero regard for whether a player still needed them alive for a mission. A world that finally felt real turned out to be a world that couldn't be trusted to finish a single scripted questline. So Bethesda did what Bethesda does. They flinched. The team fenced the system in, hard blocking the exact behaviors that made it dangerous. No stealing what a quest needed, no freelance murder outside approved conditions. The shipped version of Radiant AI kept the routines, kept the illusion of a living schedule, and quietly amputated the parts of its own intelligence that made that illusion collapse under pressure. It's the same flinch that shrank the ambitions before it, except this time the thing getting strangled wasn't scope or setting. It was a system that had actually succeeded, and succeeded so completely it became a liability. There's a real argument among fans that Bethesda should have just let it ride, shipped the chaos, let a few quests break, and given players a world where NPCs behaved like they had something to lose. Nothing about the finished game proves that version would have held together at scale, but it's worth sitting with. The lesson Bethesda actually took forward into every sandbox that followed was narrower and safer than the one their own testers stumbled into. Cutting a mind that clever out of the world left a hole, and Bethesda didn't fill it with something you could negotiate with. They filled it with things you kill on sight, and the shambling threat that ended up defining an entire era of the series almost wasn't the one you're picturing right now. The Draugr. Every ancient Nord tomb in Skyrim is haunting for one specific reason, and that reason almost got scrapped for something you'd forget by the next loading screen. Fans still call them zombies half the time, and honestly that's fair, because the design almost was exactly that. The obvious version of an undead crypt guardian is a shambling corpse groaning for brains, the laziest possible fantasy enemy recycled from 1,000 other games before it. Nothing in Bethesda's own documentation lays out a hard timeline here, but follow the pattern anyway. Early conceptions of Skyrim's signature monster were reportedly closer to generic zombies before someone decided that wasn't good enough for a game built entirely around Nordic mythology. What shipped instead is something rooted specifically in Norse myth, and the difference matters more than it sounds. Actual Draugr, the folkloric kind, aren't mindless corpses at all. They're warriors bound to their burial mounds, aware, deliberate, furious about being disturbed by whoever's stupid enough to crack open their tomb. Skyrim's version keeps that anger fully intact. These are ancient Nords, sealed away by dragon cult magic, dressed in the exact same Nordic armor they died in, still wielding weapons that somehow work centuries later. They're not filler enemies dropped in to pad a dungeon crawl. They're the dragon cult's leftover believers, still standing guard for a religion that died and rotted around them. That's the swap. The same instinct from Oblivion's crippled loot tables shows up here again, just flipped completely. There, Bethesda strangled a system that worked too well. Here they took a concept that barely worked at all and made it load-bearing for an entire game. One flinch shrinks an idea down to nothing. The other one builds it out until it becomes the thing players actually remember years later. Think about what that decision cost the player experience if it had gone the other way. Every barrow, every word wall, every silent auditorium of coffins would just be a zombie closet with better lighting. Instead, you get warriors who still believe in something, guarding treasure they died protecting, dressed in armor that tells you exactly who they were and what they lost. That's the difference between an enemy and a culture. But the most hidden thing buried in these games isn't an enemy at all. It's a performance from the one person you'd never expect to be standing inside his own world. Todd Howard. The man who has spent 30 years deciding what gets cut from these games hid himself somewhere nobody was ever supposed to find him. That is not a metaphor. Todd Howard, the director and executive producer who joined Bethesda after Arena and became a defining voice on the series starting with Daggerfall, actually voices a character somewhere inside his own games. Not a producer credit buried in a scroll of text nobody reads. An actual voice on an actual character sitting inside the finished product he could have deleted at any point in development. Think about what that means next to everything else this video has covered. Radiant AI got throttled before launch. Entire cities got cut for hardware that could not carry them. Systems got strangled, downgraded, or scrapped because they threatened to sink the whole game. Howard has spent decades as the person making those exact calls, deciding what survives and what gets buried in an unused files folder forever. And somewhere in that same pile of decisions, he made sure his own voice made the cut. The series has always had a soft spot for this kind of thing. Elder Scrolls games are stuffed with celebrity cameos and hidden developer jokes, actors voicing dragons and side characters as a wink to anyone paying attention. Howard slipping in as an unbilled voice fits that exact tradition, except this time, the person hiding in the game is the one who approves the budget for hiding things in the game. Nobody in the accessible record pins down the exact line or the exact NPC, so do not expect a name here. What fans do know is that his voice work goes back to Redguard and carried into Oblivion, tucked inside the same era he was already shaping from behind the curtain. Fans still treat it like trivia gold, hunting through minor characters and side dialogue trying to catch the director red-handed. By the time Skyrim made him the public face of the entire studio, that earlier vocal cameo stopped being a footnote and became a piece of legend. The kind of detail fans kept circling back to even after his voice stopped showing up in the credits. The executive whose job is subtraction gave himself the one line item nobody was allowed to touch. That kind of small personal touch is easy when a game takes a couple of years to build. What came next demanded the studio hold an entire world together, alive and unfinished, for the better part of a decade before a single player ever got to walk through the door. Elder Scrolls Online. Bethesda spent 7 years building a game where you cannot even play as a Nord in Skyrim without sharing the map with 3,000 other people doing the exact same quest. That is not a typo. 7 years, 1 continent, 0 shrinking back this time. The obvious story is just another MMO cash grab riding a beloved name. The actual story is a studio finally attempting the one thing it had been too scared to try since 1996. ZeniMax Online Studios did not get bolted onto an existing team as a side project. It got built from scratch, specifically and only to make an online Elder Scrolls happen. That means years of salaries, servers, and networking code before a single player ever set foot in Tamriel. No mainline game, not Morrowind, not Oblivion, not Skyrim, ever demanded that kind of infrastructure. Persistent worlds do not run on the same engine logic as a single save file on your hard drive. You need server farms. You need thousands of players occupying the same zone without the whole thing collapsing. You need systems built to survive forever, not just survive one playthrough. And the ambition behind all that plumbing was not modest. The plan was the entire continent, every province all at once, the exact fantasy that got Daggerfall's engine bent into a buggy, glitch-riddled mess back when the studio barely had the money to keep the lights on. This time there was no flinch, no cutting it down to Cyrodiil and calling it a day. 7 years of runway bought Bethesda the thing it never had in 1996, the patience to actually build the dream instead of gutting it to make a deadline. That patience did not save it from a brutal reputation on day one. Players remember the subscription fee nobody wanted, the bugs, the launch that got dragged through the mud by a community convinced the whole thing was a bloated mistake. Somewhere in there is a team that poured 7 years of their working lives into a promise, watching it get torn apart in the first 90 days. That is the tax nobody talks about when a studio finally decides not to flinch. But the game did not die. It got patched, expanded, chaptered out year after year until it actually delivered the thing Daggerfall could only dream about. The whole continent, walkable, playable, alive. Pouring 7 years into a world like that is a bet a stable, confident company makes. Long before Bethesda had that kind of patience or that kind of budget, there was a single moment when the entire franchise came within a hair of simply not existing at all. Bethesda. Almost cancelled Redguard, there was a version of Elder Scrolls history where the series just stopped. Not with a bang, not with a corporate press release, just a small studio running out of road after betting on the wrong game one too many times. That game was Redguard, and it very nearly ended everything. By 1998, Bethesda had a pattern, and the pattern was not sustainable. They kept swinging for ambition and then yanking the wheel at the last second to survive. Arena drifted from a gladiator game into an accidental RPG. Daggerfall shipped a world so big it broke under its own weight. Every single time, the studio found some way to flinch hard enough to live. Redguard was different. Redguard was the flinch that didn't work. The Elder Scrolls Adventures. Redguard dropped players on the island of Stros M'Kai, ditched the numbered RPG structure entirely, and tried to turn the franchise into a straight action-adventure game. It was Bethesda testing whether Elder Scrolls could survive outside its own formula, a genre experiment stapled onto a series still finding its identity. It did not sell like Bethesda needed it to. That failure landed during the exact stretch when Bethesda was running multiple spin-offs and side experiments at once, none of them core RPGs, and most of them underperforming. Nothing in the record hands you a signed memo that says Redguard got cancelled. But follow the pattern. A studio with thin margins, a niche title missing its numbers, and internal doubt about whether non-core Elder Scrolls games were even worth making anymore. That is not a healthy studio. That is a studio one bad quarter away from the lights going out. Think about what that actually means for the people who worked there. Every project before this had a team that got to choose the retreat, dial back the AI, cut the moon, redesign the leveling. Redguard's team did not get that luxury. They shipped their swing, and the swing did not land, and there was no clever pullback left to save it. Then Morrowind arrived on the original Xbox and new PC hardware, and the entire trajectory flipped. The series that had been bleeding out on niche experiments suddenly had its first true breakout hit. So here is the whole video in one line. The Elder Scrolls did not survive because Bethesda kept swinging big. It survived because they usually knew exactly when to pull the punch, dial back the scope, cut the feature, or redesign on the fly. Right up until Redguard, the one-time flinching wasn't enough, and the only thing that saved the franchise was the next roll of the dice actually paying off. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.